Ethan stood at the large bay window of his home office, staring out at the meticulously manicured lawn that stretched out before him. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the perfectly trimmed hedges and flower beds. The house was quiet, as it often was these days, with only the faint hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence. It was a far cry from the home he had once known, filled with laughter, conversation, and the warmth of a life well lived. As an architect, Ethan had always taken pride in his work, and his home was no exception. He had designed every inch of it, from the grand entryway with its sweeping staircase to the open-plan kitchen that flowed seamlessly into the living room. It was a house built for entertaining, for hosting dinner parties and social gatherings, a testament to the success he had achieved in his career. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. The home that was once a symbol of his success now felt cold, empty, and lifeless. Ethan couldn't quite put his finger on when things had started to change, but the signs were there. Subtle at first, but growing more pronounced with each passing day. He took a sip of the whiskey in his hand, savoring the burn as it slid down his throat. Vanessa was out again, attending another one of her high society events. She had left earlier that afternoon, dressed to the nines in a designer gown that hugged her figure in all the right places, her makeup flawless, her hair perfectly styled. She had barely said goodbye as she slipped out the door, her mind already focused on the glamorous evening ahead. Ethan couldn't remember the last time they had spent a quiet evening together, just the two of them. It used to be something they did, often dinner on the patio, talking about their day, planning for the future. But those moments had become rare, replaced by Vanessa's endless social calendar and Ethan's increasingly long hours at the office. It wasn't as though Ethan begrudged Vanessa her social life. He had always known that she thrived in those circles, that she enjoyed the attention and the excitement that came with it. But lately, it seemed as though that life had consumed her, leaving little room for anything else. He finished his drink and set the glass down on the windowsill, his thoughts drifting back to the early days of their relationship. They had met at a gallery opening, both of them young and ambitious, full of dreams for the future. Vanessa had been drawn to his confidence, his drive, the way he spoke about his work with such passion, and he had been captivated by her beauty, her charm, and the way she seemed to light up any room she entered. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of late-night dinners, spontaneous weekend getaways, and long conversations about their hopes and dreams. They had married not long after, and Ethan had thrown himself into his work, determined to build a life that would make them both proud. He had succeeded, or so he had thought. But as he looked around the empty house now, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, they had lost something important. The first sign of trouble had been small, almost insignificant at the time. A missed dinner, a forgotten anniversary, a canceled weekend away. Ethan had chalked it up to the demands of their busy lives, convinced that they would find their way back to each other once things settled down. But the distance between them had only grown, and Ethan found himself increasingly alone, left to wonder what had gone wrong. Vanessa's absences had become more frequent, her explanations vague and unsatisfying. She was always busy, always out, always doing something that seemed more important than spending time with him. When they were together, it felt forced, as though they were going through the motions of a marriage rather than actually living it. Ethan had tried to talk to her about it, but the conversations always ended the same way, with Vanessa brushing off his concerns, assuring him that everything was fine, that he was just overthinking things. She would smile, kiss him on the cheek, and tell him not to worry. But the nagging doubt in the back of his mind refused to be silenced. He had hoped that things would change, that they would find their way back to the life they had once shared. But with each passing day, that hope had grown dimmer, replaced by a growing sense of unease that Ethan couldn't quite shake. Tonight, as he stood in the darkened room, Ethan felt that unease more strongly than ever. There was something off, something wrong, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to understand what was happening, to figure out why the woman he had once loved so deeply now felt like a stranger. Ethan crossed the room to his desk, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He sat down, running a hand through his hair as he stared at the stack of paperwork that had accumulated over the past week. Normally, he would have thrown himself into his work, using it as a distraction from the thoughts that plagued him. But tonight, the paperwork held no appeal. The only thing on his mind was Vanessa, and the growing distance between them that he couldn't seem to bridge. He opened his laptop, intending to check his emails, but his hand hovered over the keyboard. Something stopped him, a feeling of hesitation that he couldn't quite explain. Instead, he found himself opening a new browser window and typing in the name of a private investigation firm he had heard about from a colleague. The idea had crossed his mind before, but he had always dismissed it, telling himself that he was being paranoid, that Vanessa would never betray him. But tonight, that doubt had taken root, and he couldn't shake it. He needed answers, even if he wasn't sure he was ready to hear them. The firm's website loaded, and Ethan found himself scrolling through the list of services they offered. Background checks, surveillance, asset investigations, it was all there, laid out in clinical, impersonal language. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the contact form. But then, with a deep breath, he clicked on it and began to fill in his details. As he typed, a sense of dread settled in his stomach. He knew that this was a line he couldn't uncross, that once he submitted the form, there would be no going back. But he couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind any longer. He needed to know the truth, whatever it might be. When he finished, he hovered over the submit button, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment he considered closing the window, pretending that he had never gone down this path. But then he thought of Vanessa, of the secrets she seemed to be hiding, and he pressed the button. The confirmation message flashed on the screen, and Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had taken the first step, but he knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Whatever the investigator found, it would change everything, either confirming his worst fears or forcing him to confront the possibility that he had been wrong all along. As he sat there, the reality of what he had just done began to sink in. He had hired a private investigator to follow his wife, to dig into her life and uncover the truth that she had been hiding from him. It was a decision born out of desperation, a last-ditch effort to salvage something from the wreckage of their marriage. But as the weight of that decision settled over him, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if he was prepared for the consequences. The truth, whatever it was, would be devastating, and once it was out, there would be no putting it back. He glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the late hour. Vanessa would be home soon, and he needed to be ready. He had to keep up the facade, to pretend that everything was fine, even as the foundation of their marriage crumbled beneath them. Ethan stood up from his desk, his resolve hardening as he walked to the window. The sky was dark now, the last remnants of daylight fading into the horizon. In the distance, he saw the headlights of Vanessa's car as it turned onto their street, the familiar sound of the engine growing louder as she pulled into the driveway. He watched as she stepped out of the car, her silhouette illuminated by the porch light. She looked beautiful, as always, her dress hugging her figure in a way that made his heart ache. But there was something different about her now, something that had changed, and Ethan couldn't ignore it any longer. As Vanessa walked up the steps and into the house, Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The doubts that had been gnawing at him for so long were about to be laid to rest, one way or another. The door opened and Vanessa stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished wood floors. She smiled when she saw him, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Ethan, you're still up? I didn't think you'd be waiting for me." Ethan forced a smile, his heart heavy with the weight of the secrets they were both keeping. "Yeah, I had some work to finish up. How was the event?" Vanessa shrugged, setting her clutch down on the table by the door. Same as always. Lots of small talk and champagne. Nothing too exciting. Ethan nodded, his mind racing as he tried to gauge the truth behind her words. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that she was telling him everything. but the nagging doubt refused to be silenced, and he knew that he wouldn't have peace until he had the answers he sought. As Vanessa walked past him, heading upstairs to change, Ethan remained at the window, staring out into the night. The first steps had been taken, and now all he could do was wait. But as he stood there, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. He knew that whatever the investigator uncovered, it would change everything, destroying the fragile remnants of trust that still existed between them and leaving their marriage in tatters. And as much as he tried to prepare himself for the truth, deep down, Ethan knew that nothing could ever truly prepare him for what was to come. The days that followed Ethan's decision to hire the private investigator were some of the longest he had ever experienced. Each hour dragged by, filled with a tense anticipation that gnawed at him from the inside. He went through the motions of his daily life meetings, project deadlines, the usual phone calls with clients, but his mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of Vanessa and the secrets she might be hiding. The investigator, a man named Richard Malone, had been discreet and professional when they met. He had a calm, reassuring demeanor that put Ethan at ease, even as he explained the details of the investigation. They had met at a quiet cafe downtown, away from prying eyes, where Richard had assured Ethan that he would get to the bottom of things quickly and discreetly. "I'll need a week or so to gather everything," Richard had said, sliding a plain manila envelope across the table. "In here, you'll find a few forms to sign, just standard agreements. I'll be in touch as soon as I have something concrete." Ethan had nodded, his stomach churning with a mix of dread and determination. He had signed the forms without hesitation, knowing that he had already crossed a line there was no coming back from. Now, as the week stretched on, Ethan found himself more on edge with each passing day. Every time Vanessa's phone buzzed with a new message, every time she left the room to take a call, a fresh wave of suspicion washed over him. He couldn't help but wonder who she was talking to, what secret she was sharing with someone else. He tried to keep up appearances, to act as though everything was normal, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to hide his growing anxiety. Vanessa had noticed. Of course, she wasn't oblivious, but she had chalked it up to work stress, to the long hours he had been putting in, and Ethan had let her believe that, preferring to keep the real reason for his tension hidden. It was late on a Wednesday evening when the call from Richard finally came. Ethan was in his office, hunched over his desk as he pretended to focus on a set of blueprints. The phone buzzed beside him, and he glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the unfamiliar number. He quickly answered, his voice tight with anticipation. "Hello, Ethan. It's Richard," came the calm voice on the other end. "I have some information for you. Can we meet?" Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "Yeah, of course. When and where?" "There is a small park on Westfield Avenue near the old courthouse. Meet me there in an hour." Ethan agreed, his mind racing as he hung up the phone. He stood up, running a hand through his hair as he tried to steady his nerves. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and yet desperately needed. Whatever Richard had found, it would change everything. An hour later, Ethan pulled up to the park, the fading daylight casting long shadows over the deserted playground. He spotted Richard sitting on a bench near a row of trees, a brown leather briefcase resting beside him. Taking a deep breath, Ethan walked over, his heart pounding in his chest. Richard looked up as Ethan approached, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "Ethan," he greeted him, motioning for him to sit. "I've got what you asked for." Ethan sat down, his hands trembling slightly as Richard reached for the briefcase. He pulled out a thick folder, the weight of it immediately sending Ethan's mind into overdrive. Richard placed it on the bench between them, his expression serious. "I'm not going to lie, Ethan," Richard began, his voice measured. "What I found isn't easy to see. I want you to prepare yourself." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "I knew what I was asking for, Richard. Just tell me what you found." Richard opened the folder, revealing a stack of photographs, documents, and printed messages. The first thing Ethan saw was a series of photos, taken from a distance, but clear enough to make out the figures in them. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized Vanessa, dressed in one of her elegant dresses, her arm linked with another man's as they entered a high-end hotel. This was taken last Friday, Richard explained, flipping through the photos. They checked into the hotel under fake names. This is Greg Dalton, CEO of Ralston Luxury Brands. They've been seeing each other for about 2 months, as far as I can tell. Ethan S. hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white as he stared at the photos. Each one felt like a punch to the gut, a visual confirmation of the betrayal he had feared but hadn't been ready to confront. Vanessa, smiling up at Greg, laughing with him, her body language so familiar, so intimate it was more than he could bear. Richard continued, his voice steady but compassionate. I also found these, he said, pulling out a stack of printed emails and text messages. They've been in contact almost daily. The messages, they are explicit. There's no doubt about what's going on between them. Ethan forced himself to look at the messages, the words blurring before his eyes as he tried to process the full extent of what he was seeing. Vanessa had poured her heart out to Greg, sharing details of their marriage, her dissatisfaction, her longing for something more. It was all there in black and white, a damning record of her infidelity. They've been meeting at various locations, Richard went on. Hotels, his private villa, even some of the events you mentioned she attended. It is clear that this isn't just a casual fling. There's more to it. Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away from the evidence. The reality of it hit him like a freight train, knocking the breath out of him. Vanessa, the woman he had loved and trusted, had been leading a double life, sharing her affection with another man while keeping him in the dark. Ethan, Richard said gently, closing the folder. I know this is a lot to take in, but you needed to know the truth. Now that you have it, the next steps are up to you. Ethan nodded numbly, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of loss. He had suspected, but seeing the evidence laid out so clearly, so undeniably, was something else entirely. It was like a part of him had been ripped away, leaving a gaping hole where his trust in Vanessa had once been. What do I do now? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard gave him a sympathetic look. That's up to you, Ethan. You can confront her, try to work things out, or you can take this to a lawyer. The evidence is strong enough to protect your interests if you decide to go that route. Ethan sat back, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew that whatever he chose, there would be no easy answers. His marriage, his life, everything he had built with Vanessa, it was all hanging in the balance. But as the initial shock began to fade, a new resolve took hold. He wouldn't let Vanessa's betrayal destroy him. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let it all crumble now. He would find a way to regain control, to take back what was his. Thank you, Richard, Ethan said, his voice steadier now. I appreciate everything you've done. Richard nodded, packing up the remaining documents. If you need anything else, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm here to help. Ethan stood up, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. I'll be in touch. As he walked back to his car, the folder felt like a lead weight in his hand. The truth was out, and there was no going back. He knew that the hardest part was yet to come, the confrontation, the decisions that would shape the rest of his life. But as he started the engine and drove away, one thought echoed in his mind. Vanessa had made her choice. Now, it was time for him to make his. Ethan had never felt time pass so slowly. The drive back from the park felt like an eternity, with the evidence of Vanessa's betrayal burning a hole in the passenger seat beside him. The streets were quiet, the lights from the shops and houses blurring together as he sped through the city, his mind racing faster than his car. When he finally pulled into the driveway of their home, he sat in the car for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his breathing. The house loomed before him, dark and silent, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside him. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The confrontation that would determine the future of his marriage and his life. Ethan grabbed the folder, the weight of it heavy in his hands, and stepped out of the car. The night air was cool, but he barely felt it as he walked up to the front door. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the handle, his mind swirling with thoughts of what was about to happen. But there was no turning back now. He had the truth, and it was time for Vanessa to face it. He opened the door and stepped inside. The house was as quiet as ever, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. Vanessa's coat was draped over the back of the chair by the door, a casual sign of her presence that now felt like an affront to everything Ethan had believed in. "Vanessa?" Ethan called out, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. He heard movement upstairs, the soft shuffle of footsteps on the carpet, and then Vanessa appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing one of her silk robes, her hair slightly tousled from sleep. She looked down at him, a sleepy smile on her lips, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. "Ethan, you're home late," she said, her voice gentle, like she was talking to the husband she had once loved. "I didn't hear you come in." Ethan looked up at her, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. "We need to talk, Vanessa." Vanessa frowned slightly, sensing the tension in his voice. She descended the stairs slowly, her eyes narrowing as she took in his expression. "What's wrong?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked into the living room, flicking on the light. Vanessa followed him, her earlier smile fading into concern. He turned to face her, his gaze hard and unwavering. "What's wrong?" Ethan repeated, his voice low and controlled. "I think you know exactly what's wrong." Vanessa blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "Ethan, I don't lie to me, Vanessa." Ethan cut her off, his voice sharp. "I know everything." Vanessa froze, her eyes widening in shock. "What are you talking about?" Ethan held up the folder, his knuckles white as he gripped it. "This," he said, his voice filled with a quiet fury. "This is what I am talking about." He tossed the folder onto the coffee table, the contents spilling out photos of her with Greg, printed emails detailing their affair, and evidence that couldn't be ignored. Vanessa stared at the incriminating pile, her face draining of color as she realized what she was looking at. "How long, Vanessa?" Ethan demanded, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been sneaking around behind my back, pretending like everything was fine?" Vanessa didn't answer immediately. She stood there, her eyes locked on the photos, her mind racing to find some way out, some explanation that could mitigate the damage. But there was nothing. The evidence was undeniable, and she knew it. "Ethan, Vanessa began, but her voice faltered, unable to find the words. "Spare me the excuses," Ethan interrupted, his voice cold. "I want the truth, Vanessa. Just this once, I want you to be honest with me." Vanessa swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew there was no way to lie her way out of this. She had been caught, and now she had to face the consequences. "It's been 2 months," Vanessa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Ethan. It just did." Ethan's eyes flashed with anger. 2 months? 2 months of lying to me, of sneaking around, of pretending like nothing was wrong? Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? How could you do this to us, Vanessa? How could you do this to me? Vanessa's eyes filled with tears as she took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Ethan, please, I never wanted to hurt you. I was lonely. You were always working, always focused on your projects, and I felt like you didn't see me anymore. I know it was wrong, but Greg, he made me feel like I mattered again." Ethan stared at her, his chest tight with a mix of rage and pain. "So you threw everything away for a fling? For some cheap thrill with a man who doesn't give a damn about you?" "It wasn't like that," Vanessa protested, her voice breaking. "I wasn't looking for anything. It happened. I was feeling so empty. And he was there, offering me something I thought I'd lost." "Something you thought you'd lost?" Ethan echoed, disbelief in his voice. "What about what I've lost, Vanessa? What about the life we built together, the trust we had? Was that worth so little to you that you could just throw it all away for some meaningless affair?" Vanessa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan, I am so sorry. I know I've made a terrible mistake, but I still love you. I never stopped loving you. I lost my way." Ethan's heart ached at her words, but the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface refused to be quelled. "Love? Dante talked to me about love, Vanessa. If you loved me, You wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have betrayed me like this." Vanessa reached out to him, desperation in her eyes. "Ethan, please, we can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I'll end things with Greg. I'll go to counseling, just please. Don't give up on us." Ethan took a step back, shaking his head. "You think this is something you can just fix? Like it's a mistake that can be undone with a few apologies? You shattered my trust, Vanessa. You shattered everything we had." Vanessa's sobs grew louder as she pleaded with him. "I know, Ethan. I know I've hurt you, but I am begging you to give me a chance to make it right. I'll do anything to save our marriage." Ethan looked at her, his heart torn between the love he had once felt for her and the deep, searing pain of her betrayal. He had always thought of Vanessa as his partner, his confidant, the person he could trust above all others. But now, all he could see was a stranger, a woman who had lied to him, who had shared her life with someone else. "You made your choice, Vanessa," Ethan said, his voice cold and final. "You chose him. You chose this." Vanessa shook her head frantically. "No, Ethan, I chose you. I still choose you. Please, don't do this. Don't walk away from us." Ethan's jaw clenched as he fought to keep his emotions in check. "You walked away from us the moment you let him into your life, the moment you decided that what we had wasn't enough." Vanessa fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Ethan, please, I am begging you. Don't end it like this." Ethan stared down at her, his heart breaking at the sight of her despair. But the pain of her betrayal was too great, too overwhelming. He couldn't see a way forward, couldn't see how they could ever rebuild what had been broken. "I can't do this, Vanessa," Ethan said quietly, his voice full of sorrow. "I can't pretend that everything is okay. I can't pretend that I can ever trust you again." Vanessa's sobs grew louder as she reached for him, but Ethan turned away, unable to bear the sight of her any longer. "I'll be staying in the guest room tonight," he said, his voice cold and detached. "Tomorrow we'll talk about how to move forward. But for now, I need space." Vanessa collapsed onto the floor, her cries echoing through the empty house as Ethan walked away. The sound of her despair filled the air, but Ethan forced himself to keep walking, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he knew he had to make. As he entered the guest room and closed the door behind him, the reality of the situation hit him with full force. His marriage was over, destroyed by lies and betrayal, and no matter how much he wanted to turn back time to fix what had been broken, he knew that it was too late. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall as the silence of the house closed in around him. Vanessa's sobs had quieted, leaving only the sound of his own breathing to fill the void. He had made his decision, and now he would have to live with it. Ethan awoke the next morning to a quiet house, the sunlight filtering weakly through the curtains of the guest room. For a moment, he lay there in bed, disoriented and heavy with the events of the night before. The confrontation with Vanessa, her desperate pleas, the betrayal that still stung like an open wound, it all came flooding back in a rush of emotion. He sat up slowly, his body aching with the weight of it all. The bed felt foreign, unfamiliar, a stark reminder of the distance he had put between himself and the life he once knew. The decision to sleep in the guest room had been an act of self-preservation, a way to put physical space between him and the pain that threatened to consume him. Ethan rubbed his hands over his face, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. But there was no escaping the reality that awaited him. The truth of Vanessa's betrayal hung over him like a dark cloud, and he knew that he couldn't avoid it any longer. The silence in the house was oppressive, amplifying the sense of isolation that had taken root in his heart. He stood up, pulling on a shirt and jeans, and walked over to the window. Outside, the world carried on as usual, birds chirping in the trees, the distant hum of traffic, the normalcy of a day that felt anything but normal. He thought about Vanessa, wondered if she was awake, if she was still lying on the floor where he had left her. The image of her, broken and crying, flashed in his mind, and he felt a pang of guilt mixed with the anger that still simmered just beneath the surface. He had never seen her like that before, so vulnerable, so desperate. But as much as it hurt him to see her like that, it didn't change what she had done. It didn't erase the betrayal, the lies, The cold, hard fact that she had chosen someone else over him, that she had been willing to risk everything they had built together for the sake of a fleeting thrill. Ethan left the guest room and made his way downstairs, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The house felt empty, hollow, a shell of the home it had once been. He passed the living room, his eyes briefly flicking to the coffee table where the folder still lay, the evidence of Vanessa's affair scattered across it. He couldn't bear to look at it, couldn't bear to see those photos and messages that had torn his world apart. He continued into the kitchen, where the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. Vanessa was sitting at the kitchen island, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red and puffy from a night of crying. She had changed out of her silk robe and was now wearing a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She looked like a shadow of the woman he had once known, her usual confidence replaced by a deep sadness that seemed to weigh her down. "Ethan," Vanessa said softly, her voice tentative, as if she wasn't sure how to approach him. "Can we talk?" Ethan walked over to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He didn't answer right away, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. His emotions were a tangled mess: anger, sadness, betrayal, and a deep, aching sense of loss. He knew they needed to talk, but he wasn't sure he was ready for what that conversation would bring. He turned to face her, his expression guarded. "What is there to talk about, Vanessa? You said everything last night." Vanessa's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she blinked them away, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her cup. "I know I hurt you, Ethan. I know I betrayed your trust in the worst possible way. But I need you to know that I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to lose you." Ethan's jaw tightened as he took a sip of his coffee, the bitterness mirroring the emotions churning inside him. "But you did lose me, Vanessa. You lost me the moment you decided that our marriage wasn't enough for you. The moment you decided to share your life with someone else." Vanessa's voice cracked as she spoke, her emotions laid bare. "I was wrong, Ethan. I was so wrong, and I hate myself for it. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you to give me a chance to make things right. Please, let me try to fix this." Ethan set his cup down on the counter, his eyes meeting hers with a mix of anger and sorrow. "How can you fix this, Vanessa? How can you fix the fact that you destroyed everything we had? That you broke my trust in ways that can never be repaired?" Vanessa's tears spilled over, her hands reaching out to him in desperation. "I don't know, Ethan. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. I want to fight for us, for the life we had. I still love you, and I can't imagine my life without you." Ethan stared at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that they could somehow find their way back to each other. But the pain of her betrayal was still so fresh, so raw, that the thought of forgiving her seemed impossible. "Love isn't enough, Vanessa," Ethan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Not anymore. You made a choice, and that choice has consequences. We can't just go back to the way things were. We can't pretend that this never happened." Vanessa's shoulders shook with silent sobs, her hands falling to her sides. "I know, Ethan. I know things will never be the same, but I am willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. I'll go to counseling, I'll do whatever you ask, just please don't you walk away from us." Ethan looked away, his gaze fixed on the window as he tried to keep his emotions in check. The thought of losing her, of losing the life they had built together, filled him with a deep sense of dread. But the trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship was gone, shattered into a million pieces by her actions. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Vanessa," Ethan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." Vanessa's sobs grew louder, her tears falling freely as she tried to find the right words. "Please, Ethan, please don't give up on us. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you to give me a chance to make things right." Ethan remained silent, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of emotions. He knew that the decision he made now would shape the rest of his life, that it would determine whether they would try to rebuild their marriage or let it crumble into nothing. but he also knew that he wasn't ready to make that decision yet. The pain was too fresh, the wound too deep. "I need time, Vanessa," Ethan said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I need time to figure out what I want, what I need. I can to make any promises and I can to guarantee that things will ever be the same. But for now, I need space." Vanessa nodded, her tears falling silently as she accepted his words. "Take all the time you need, Ethan. I will be here waiting, hoping that we can find a way through this." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't bring himself to offer her any comfort, any reassurance. The weight of her betrayal was too great, and the future felt too uncertain. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, the sound of Vanessa's quiet sobs following him as he left the room. As he made his way back upstairs, he felt the full weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had chosen to distance himself, to take time to process everything that had happened, but he knew that it wouldn't be easy. The days that followed were some of the most difficult Ethan had ever experienced. The once familiar rhythms of his life now felt alien, as if he were going through the motions of someone else's existence. He threw himself into his work, spending long hours at the office, but even that failed to provide the escape he sought. Everywhere he turned, he was haunted by thoughts of Vanessa, of the life they had once shared, and the future that now seemed so uncertain. Vanessa, for her part, kept her distance, respecting his need for space. She continued with her usual routines, but there was a heaviness to her movements, a sadness in her eyes that had not been there before. She tried to talk to him on several occasions, to bridge the growing chasm between them, but Ethan remained distant, his heart still too raw to entertain the idea of reconciliation. At night, Ethan would lie awake in the guest room, staring up at the ceiling as memories of their life together played out in his mind. He thought about the early days of their marriage, the laughter, the shared dreams, the promises they had made to each other. He thought about the love they had once shared, a love that had seemed unbreakable, and he wondered how it had all gone so wrong. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan began to feel the weight of his decision. He knew that he couldn't keep living in limbo, that he couldn't keep avoiding the reality of his situation. He needed to make a choice, to decide whether he was willing to try to rebuild what had been broken or whether it was time to let go. But the thought of making that decision filled him with a deep sense of dread. He knew that either choice would come with its own set of challenges, its own set of consequences, and no matter what he chose, he knew that his life would never be the same. One evening, as he sat in his office, staring at the pile of paperwork that had gone untouched for days, Ethan felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He couldn't keep living like this, caught between the past and the future, unable to move forward. He needed to find a way to heal, to move on, whether that meant rebuilding his marriage or walking away from it for good. He stood up, the decision finally forming in his mind, and walked downstairs. Vanessa was sitting in the living room, a book in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her expression distant, as if she were lost in her own thoughts. "Vanessa," Ethan said quietly, and she looked up, startled by the sound of his voice. "We need to talk." Vanessa set the book aside, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked at him. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What is it?" Ethan walked over to the couch and sat down across from her, his expression serious. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice steady. "About us, about our marriage, and about what happened." Vanessa nodded, her eyes searching his for any sign of hope, any indication that he was ready to forgive her. "And?" Ethan took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Vanessa. What you did, it broke something in me. It broke the trust we had, the foundation of our marriage, and I don't know if that can ever be repaired." Vanessa's heart sank, her eyes filling with tears. "Ethan, please, don't say that. I know I hurt you, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. I'll go to counseling. Ethan held up a hand, cutting her off. "I know you are willing to try, Vanessa, and part of me wants to try too, but the truth is, I'm not sure if I can. I'm not sure if I can ever look at you the same way again, if I can ever trust you again. And I don't want to live a life filled with doubt, always wondering if you're being honest with me." Vanessa's tears spilled over, her voice trembling as she spoke. "So what are you saying? Are you saying it's over?" Ethan looked at her, his heart aching at the sight of her pain. He wished he could give her the answer she wanted, wished he could tell her that everything would be okay, that they could find a way to move forward together. But he couldn't lie to her, and he couldn't lie to himself. "I don't know," Ethan said softly, his voice filled with sorrow. "I don't know what the future holds for us, Vanessa, but I do know that I need time. I need time to figure out what I want, what I need, and I think you need time too." Vanessa nodded, her tears falling silently as she accepted his words. "I understand, Ethan. I'll give you all the time you need, but please, please don't give up on us completely." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to offer her the hope she so desperately sought. All he knew was that he needed to take things one day at a time, to allow himself the space to heal, to process everything that had happened. As he stood up to leave, Vanessa reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle, tentative. "I love you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens, I want you to know that." Ethan looked down at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "I know, Vanessa," he said quietly. "I know." He pulled his hand away, the distance between them feeling more real than ever. As he walked back upstairs, he felt the full weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had chosen to take a step back, to allow himself the time and space he needed to heal, but he knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. For now, all he could do was take things one day at a time, one step at a time, and hope that eventually he would find the clarity he sought. The days that followed Ethan's emotional conversation with Vanessa were marked by a profound sense of isolation. The house, once filled with warmth and memories of happier times, now felt cold and empty. Ethan went through the motions of his daily life, going to work, attending meetings, and coming home to the quiet stillness of a place that no longer felt like home. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, a constant battle between the desire to move forward and the weight of the past. The trust that had once formed the foundation of his marriage had been shattered, and no matter how much he tried to piece it back together, he couldn't shake the feeling that something irreparable had been broken. Vanessa, for her part, kept her distance, giving Ethan the space he had asked for. She spent most of her days out of the house, visiting friends or taking long walks through the city, trying to find some semblance of normalcy in a life that had been turned upside down. When she was home, she moved quietly, careful not to intrude on Ethan's space, but the unspoken tension between them was palpable, a constant reminder of the pain they were both trying to navigate. Ethan had been avoiding the inevitable, but he knew he couldn't put it off any longer. The time had come to make a decision about the future of his marriage, to determine whether he was willing to try to rebuild what had been broken or whether it was time to walk away. The weight of that decision pressed down on him, suffocating him with the enormity of what it meant. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, staring blankly at the stack of paperwork on his desk, Ethan felt a sense of clarity begin to take shape in his mind. The decision he had been dreading, the choice that had seemed so impossible, was starting to become clear. He had spent so long trying to find a way to forgive Vanessa, to reconcile the love he still felt for her with the deep sense of betrayal that gnawed at him. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the truth their marriage had been irreparably damaged by her actions. The trust that had once been the bedrock of their relationship was gone, and no amount of counseling or promises could bring it back. Ethan knew that continuing to live in this limbo, caught between the past and an uncertain future, was only prolonging the inevitable. It was time to move on, to let go of the life they had once shared and begin the process of healing on his own terms. With a heavy heart, Ethan picked up the phone and dialed the number of his divorce attorney, the one Richard Malone had recommended after their first meeting. The conversation was brief, the details practical and to the point. Ethan explained the situation, and the attorney assured him that with the evidence they had, the divorce proceedings would be straightforward. Vanessa's infidelity would ensure that Ethan retained the majority of their assets, protecting his financial interests in the aftermath of the separation. When the call ended, Ethan sat back in his chair, the reality of what he had just done settling over him like a lead blanket. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. He had chosen to end his marriage, to walk away from the woman he had once loved with all his heart. The sense of finality was both devastating and strangely liberating. The next morning, Ethan asked Vanessa to meet him in the living room. She appeared hesitant, her eyes red from what he assumed were more nights spent crying. She sat down on the couch, folding her hands in her lap as she waited for him to speak. "Vanessa," Ethan began, his voice calm but firm, "I've made a decision." Vanessa's heart skipped a beat, her stomach twisting in knots as she braced herself for what he was about to say. "What is it, Ethan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady. "I have decided that it is time for us to end this. Our marriage is over. I have already spoken to a lawyer and I am filing for divorce." Vanessa's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in shock. "Divorce?" she repeated, the word sounding foreign and terrifying as it left her lips. "Ethan, no, please, we can still work this out. We can go to counseling, we can—" "It is too late for that, Vanessa," Ethan interrupted, his voice resolute. "I've thought about it long and hard, and I have come to the conclusion that there's no going back. The trust is gone, and without it, our marriage can't survive." Vanessa's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she tried to process what he was saying. "Ethan, please, I know I've made mistakes, but I love you. I don't want to lose you." Ethan's expression softened, but his resolve remained firm. "I know you do, Vanessa. And I loved you too. But love isn't enough to fix what is broken. We have both been through too much, and I think it's time we both move on." Vanessa shook her head, her tears spilling over as she reached out to him. "Please, Ethan, don't do this. Don't give up on us." Ethan took her hands in his voice gentle but unwavering. "I'm not giving up, Vanessa. I am choosing to protect myself, to protect what's left of my heart. I am choosing to let go." Vanessa's sobs grew louder, her heart breaking as she realized that there was nothing she could say or do to change his mind. The life they had built together, the dreams they had shared, were crumbling before her eyes, and she was powerless to stop it. Ethan stood up, letting go of her hands as he took a step back. "The lawyer will be in touch with the details. We'll figure out the logistics, and I'll make sure you are taken care of. But after that, we need to go our separate ways." Vanessa looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "Ethan, please." But Ethan had already turned away, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He walked out of the living room, leaving Vanessa alone with her grief, the sound of her sobs echoing in the empty space he had left behind. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings with lawyers, and painful conversations. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, thanks to the overwhelming evidence of Vanessa's infidelity, and within weeks their marriage was officially dissolved. The house, once a symbol of their life together, was put up for sale, and the proceeds were divided according to the terms of the settlement. Ethan found a small apartment downtown, a modest place that suited his new, simpler life. He spent most of his time at work, throwing himself into his projects as a way to distract himself from the pain of the past. But no matter how busy he kept himself, there were moments when the loneliness crept in, when the memories of his life with Vanessa would resurface, bringing with them a fresh wave of sorrow. Vanessa, too, struggled to come to terms with the end of their marriage. She moved in with a friend temporarily, unsure of where to go or what to do next. The life she had known, the life she had taken for granted, was gone, and she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered world. Greg, the man who had been the catalyst for it all, quickly distanced himself from her once the scandal became public knowledge. He was more concerned with protecting his reputation than with offering her any real support. Vanessa found herself alone, ostracized by the social circle she had once been a part of, and forced to confront the reality of her choices. As time passed, Ethan began to heal. The wounds were still there, but they were slowly scarring over, becoming less raw with each passing day. He started to rediscover parts of himself that had been lost in the chaos of his marriage: his love for music, his passion for photography, the simple joy of a quiet evening spent reading. He began to find solace in these small pleasures, and they helped him rebuild his sense of self, piece by piece. One afternoon, as he was packing up his office after a long day, Ethan received a text message from Vanessa. It was the first time she had reached out since the divorce was finalized, and he hesitated before opening it. The message was brief, simple, but filled with emotion. "I am sorry for everything. I hope you find happiness, Ethan. You deserve it." Ethan stared at the message for a long time, the words sinking in. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a sense of closure that he hadn't realized he needed. He didn't respond, knowing that there was nothing more to say. The chapter of his life with Vanessa had come to an end, and it was time to turn the page. As he left the office and walked out into the cool evening air, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it. He had made the difficult decision to let go, and in doing so, he had found the strength to move forward. And as he walked down the street, the sun setting in the distance, Ethan knew that he would be okay. He had survived the storm, and now it was time to start anew. The weeks that followed the finalization of the divorce were a time of quiet reflection for Ethan. The apartment he had moved into was small, minimalist, a stark contrast to the home he had shared with Vanessa. But it was his space, free of the memories that had haunted him in the weeks leading up to the divorce. It was a place where he could begin to rebuild his life, to find out who he was outside of the marriage that had defined him for so long. Ethan had always been a man of routine, and he found comfort in establishing new ones. His mornings started with a run along the waterfront, the crisp air invigorating as he pushed himself to clear his mind. He would grab a coffee from the cafe around the corner, where the barista had started to remember his order: a simple black coffee, no frills. From there, he would head to the office, where he immersed himself in his work, pouring his energy into new projects that challenged him and reignited his passion for architecture. But there was more to this new life than just work. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to explore the interests he had neglected during his marriage. He dusted off his old camera, rediscovering his love for photography as he wandered through the city, capturing moments of beauty and stillness that he had overlooked for so long. He spent weekends visiting art galleries, attending live music performances, and even trying his hand at cooking, experimenting with recipes that filled his apartment with the comforting aromas of home-cooked meals. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of loneliness, of doubt, when he wondered if he had made the right decision. Nights when he would lie awake, the silence of his apartment pressing in on him, and he would think about Vanessa, about the life they had shared, the dreams they had once had. He would wonder where she was, what she was doing, and if she had found a way to move on. But those moments were becoming less frequent. With each passing day, the weight of the past lifted a little more, replaced by a growing sense of peace and acceptance. Ethan was learning to live in the present, to appreciate the small joys of each day, and to let go of the pain that had once consumed him. One afternoon, Ethan found himself walking through a park he hadn't visited in years. The trees were just beginning to turn, their leaves a riot of autumn colors that painted the landscape in warm, vibrant hues. He had his camera with him, capturing the golden light as it filtered through the branches, the leaves crunching underfoot as he wandered along the path. As he rounded a bend, he came across a small pond, its surface still and reflective. A few ducks paddled lazily near the edge, their movements creating gentle ripples that spread across the water. Ethan knelt down, adjusting the lens of his camera, and snapped a photo, the click of the shutter echoing in the quiet of the afternoon. He stood up, taking a moment to admire the scene, and felt a sense of contentment settle over him. It was a simple moment, nothing extraordinary, but it was a moment of peace, of clarity, and Ethan realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. As he continued his walk, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. The pain of discovering Vanessa's betrayal, the anger and sadness that had followed, the difficult decision to end their marriage, it had all led him here, to this place of calm and acceptance. It hadn't been an easy path, but it had been a necessary one. And for the first time, Ethan felt truly at peace with the choices he had made. That evening, as he sat in his apartment, a glass of wine in hand, Ethan reflected on the lessons he had learned from the experience. He had learned that trust was fragile, easily shattered, but difficult to rebuild. He had learned that love alone wasn't always enough to sustain a relationship, that it required effort, communication, and a willingness to face the hard truths. But most importantly, he had learned that he was stronger than he had ever realized, that he had the resilience to pick himself up and move forward, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. Ethan knew that the future still held challenges, that there would be more obstacles to overcome, more moments of doubt and fear. But he also knew that he had the strength to face them, to continue building a life that was true to who he was, a life that brought him happiness and fulfillment. As he finished his glass of wine, Ethan thought about what advice he would give to someone else going through a similar situation. He would tell them that it was okay to feel pain, to feel lost, but that they shouldn't let it define them. He would tell them to take things one day at a time, to focus on the small victories, and to remember that healing was a process, not a destination. And most importantly, he would tell them to be kind to themselves, to forgive themselves for the mistakes they had made, and to allow themselves the space to grow and move on. The phone buzzed on the table, pulling Ethan from his thoughts. It was a message from a friend, inviting him to a small gathering that weekend. Ethan smiled, typing a quick reply to confirm that he would be there. It was another step forward, another opportunity to connect with others, to continue building the new life he had started. As he set the phone down, Ethan felt a sense of optimism for the future. The wounds of the past were still there, but they were healing, and he knew that he was on the right path. The road ahead was his to shape, and he was ready to embrace whatever it brought. The night was quiet as Ethan prepared for bed, the city outside his window alive with the soft hum of life. He climbed into bed, the cool sheets a welcome comfort after a long day, and as he closed his eyes, he felt a sense of contentment wash over him. He had survived the storm, weathered the darkest days, and now he was finally moving forward. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer held him back. He was free to live, to love, and to create a future that was truly his own. And as sleep took him, Ethan knew that he would be okay, more than okay. He would thrive. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to my channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story and what stories you want to hear.